Yes, hello once again, and welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, but more especially, welcome to the 2023 Helsington Classic Scramble. Yes, hello once again, welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, and as you can see we're out and about on our travels once again, and today we've made the journey from Scotland to Kendal in Cumbria to cover the 2023 Helsington Classic Scramble. Now this event of course is hosted by the very well respected Westmoreland Motor Club, who have been putting on trials, scrambles and even four-wheeled motorsport events in and around this area for many years. So when it comes to putting on one of these classic scrambles, they certainly know how to make it all come together. But this Helsington racetrack does have a bit of history down the years, and I think it was only last year in 2022 when this racetrack was brought back to life. So we're looking forward to hearing the thunder of these old classic motorcycles on this very historic Helsington racetrack. Now, with regards to the classes for today's racing, we have, of course, the pre-1960s vintage classes right up to the relatively modern 1980 bikes of the twin shock class. And, of course, scattered in between there will be plenty of those little 125 screamers. But of course, before we see any bikes racing on the track, we have to take a look at some of the bikes that are soon to take part in this Helsington Classic Scramble. So let's head back to the paddock and just check out a few of those lovely machines. Okay, so this will be a two-part edition of In the Paddock at this Helsington Scramble, as there were just far too many bikes at this event this year to include them all in these short videos. So we've picked out just a few examples here to show you for this part one. And so our first featured bike here is Ian Stanton's quite rare Gemini Triumph Classic. Now, as to what is an actual Gemini Triumph, I just haven't a clue, but as I understand, it was some kind of copy of a Rickman frame, and although Ian did furnish me with a few facts on the day that I grabbed these video clips, he did say that he would send me all of the details on the bike as soon as he could. So what we'll do is we'll do a much more in-depth feature on Ian's Gemini Triumph at a later date, but certainly at first glance you can see how people could mistake this bike as just another British Rickman racer, because it does have a chassis not unlike a Rickman frame, and of course it's also powered by this pre-unit Triumph twin motor. And again, I'm assuming that this fuel tank here is of a fiberglass construction, just as in those Rickman bikes from the 1960s. But you can also see here that the chassis construction here at the headstock is not the same as the aforementioned Rickmans, as it's a completely different design. But as in many of these old 1960s British built bikes, many of them did use these Italian-made Serie Anni forks, mainly because these were slightly better in their design and performance than the British equivalents. Although, as I just mentioned, once Ian supplies me with all of the relevant information about the bike's construction and history, then we'll certainly do a much more full, in-depth feature on this bike at a later date. Right, so next up, a quick look at a very nice CCM bike that was built by Keith Barnes, a man who certainly likes his Alan Clues classics. But again, Keith's put together another belter of a bike, and although your first impressions make it look like it's an original 1979 CCM bike from that year, this fantastic looking thumper is actually a reproduction interpretation of one of the many CCM classic bikes that Alan Clues designed at his Bolton bike factory in those golden years of the 1970s. Now the chassis, as I said, is a perfect reproduction copy of the original Clues design, and these frames are now being remanufactured by Joe Maxwell Engineering at Thornhill in Scotland, who also manufactures and sells many of the other parts to reconstruct one of these CCM clones. And once again, those beautifully sculpted engine casings there with the footrest hangers bolted onto the side of the casing, which were of course a CCM design back in the day, and as you're already aware, that big B50 BSA derived engine is the CCM's power plant. And I can also see that Keith's had the updated oil filtration system added onto his motor. But the front forks that are fitted onto Keith's machine are not the original parts, because the stock CCM forks for that year are just like gold dust to find these days. So these are actually a pair of forks from, I think it was an 83 or an 84 CR 500 Honda bike. And at the back end of our CCM we have a pair of top quality Swedish made Öhlins piggyback gas and oil units, and as far as off-road motorcycle suspensions go, you probably would be very hard pressed to beat these Öhlins shocks for performance and reliability. But these CCM frames, as you know, were all chrome plated in that year, but Alan Clues eventually then returned to simply painting their frames in the years that followed. And as you can see, the bike's rear hubs and wheels are all brand new parts, and these gold coloured Acront wheels certainly go very well with this similarly coloured CCM replica fuel tank, which, if I'm not mistaken, is another one of those parts that's supplied through Joe Maxwell Engineering. Now also, all of the plastics on Keith's bike are once more a modern interpretation of the old Preston Petty plastics, which were used to very good effect on these Clues bikes back in the 1970s, although nowadays it is easy enough to buy or build your own CCM replica, because there are a few companies now manufacturing replica parts to build these bikes, but the biggest hurdle, of course, is trying to find engine casings and internal components. But other than that, you can pretty much get hold of all of the other bits and pieces, as of course Keith has done here. And as you can see, it was a simple big bore straight through exhaust on these CCM thumpers. And although Keith's bike here is maybe not an original stock bike from 1979, the finish and the detail on this machine is just simply stunning. And here we see Keith's young lad, little Jack there, who wanted to be on TV pictured with his dad's bike, so of course we quite happily obliged him. And so the next bike on our Paddock walkabout at the Helsington Classic Scramble was Peter Gerrard's 360 twin port CZ, which I just managed to grab a few pictures of before the heavens opened up and the monsoon rains began. But once more, Peter's bike here is not a stock original Czechoslovakian racer, because it does have a few hybrid parts bolted onto it. But as I keep saying, very few of these older bikes nowadays still have all of their factory components still bolted in place, mainly due to their aging years. And it's the same here in Peter's case, but it's much more important to keep these bikes running and on the racetrack than worrying about if they've got the same original brake lever that it had back in the 1960s or 70s. And as you can see in this shot, Peter's naturally fitted one of his very own design remote gear shifter mechanisms to the motor, which he manufactures for these old CZ machines. Now, some of the other parts that are fitted onto Peter's 360, like this exhaust expansion chamber, all come directly from the Czech Republic, where I do believe that they are now manufacturing these pipes and lots of other components like them to fit onto these two-stroke CZ race bikes. But nevertheless, a stock original bike or not, who actually cares? Because as long as the bike is still taking part in what it was originally built to do, and that was, of course, dig up the dirt and have lots of fun in the process. Okay, so our next featured machine is Mark Silverton's 1980 RM 125 Suzuki, which certainly looks like it's already been around the racetrack, judging by its quite scruffy and unwashed appearance. But I do remember Mark was telling me that he'd taken part in another race event the week before, so it probably wasn't worth him washing off that track debris if it was going to be used again in just a few days' time. But Mark's little 125 here is fitted with one of these upgraded D&G alloy cylinder heads, which I expect is a performance upgrade on the Suzuki original part. But back in the day, these smaller 125 two-stroke motors were just fantastic little power plants, and in fact they still are, as you'll soon find out when you see this little beauty perform on the racetrack when I eventually get around to posting all the racing footage from this event. But certainly Mark's little RM125 here was just one of many 125s that were scattered around the paddock over the course of the day, and I could quite easily have made up a 2-hour video using just these 125 examples. Such were the numbers of these little screamers that were at the Helsington Scramble on the day. But for the purpose of our walkabout, we've only just picked out one or two. Although I have to say, Mark's little D&G Suzuki certainly looked quite good here in the early morning sunshine at Helsington, which was a very nice relief from the monsoon rains that fell on the track overnight. But we did have two classes for 125s on the day, the Twin Shock A and Twin Shock B class, which almost filled the start line in each of those categories. But certainly, once again, a nice but quite dirty example of an RM125 Suzuki there from Mark Silverton. And so from an unwashed 125 Suzuki, we move on to the other end of the scale, to an immaculately prepared 1977 250 RM Suzuki, and this is Kieran Jones's current race bike. And once more, this is not your stock original example of a 77 RM, but nevertheless a very nice piece of kit, and another one of the many bikes that will be racing in the popular Twin Shock 250 class later in the day. Now, as I remember, these 77 RMs were pretty good bikes back in the day, as they had quite a decent chrome molly chassis and swing arm, and of course that alloy gas tank as well. And the motor again was a pretty awesome piece of machinery on these Suzuki 250s, fueled of course by a 36mm Mikuni and case reed induction, and of course these also had a 5-speed gearbox as well. And for 1977 this was still quite a rapid, powerful engine for such a smaller 250, and even straight out of the crate these RMs were highly competitive, and that's even before you ever even laid a spanner on its parts. Now, the old original mild steel tailpipe from 77's also been swapped here for this much lighter and better performing alloy component. But the rear shocks again are those hugely popular YSS piggyback suspension units, and as far as I'm aware, this bike still has its stock Suzuki front forks, which I'm sure were Kayabas back in the day. But without doubt, a very nice example of one of these 1977 Suzy RM 250s. So we're certainly looking forward to seeing young Kieran put this bike through its paces when he takes to the racetrack. So once again, look out for Kieran on this lovely RM 250 Suzuki. Okay, so next up it's another cracker of a bike from Neil Jones, and this is Neil's CR250 Honda Red Rocket from 1980. Now, there were certainly many Red Rockets on display at Helsington this year that you quite easily could have had a full gate of these Red Roosters all lined up for their own race. And in fact, there were so many of these Honda 250s going around at Helsington that I just can't understand how some organisations just haven't started up a British 250 Honda Red Rocket Championship, because there's certainly no shortage of available bikes that would have taken part. Although our particular example here from Neil Jones has had a few wee tweaks and upgrades to what was the original Honda design, starting of course with these beefier and stronger Showa forks. And another nice touch on this bike is of course this custom made alloy airbox, which replaced the original Honda plastic item from 1980. But of course, as you've come to expect from Honda engineering, even in 1980 these two-stroke motors were certainly a revelation when they were introduced to the UK in the late 1970s, and it wasn't too long after that when riders began ditching their European-made Bultacos, CZs, Micos and many other European bikes so that they could get their hands on one of these quicker and much better engineered Honda rocket ships. Although I'm not entirely sure why Neil changed this airbox on his bike, although I suspect it may be something to do with the old plastic Honda items that did have a tendency to crack and break. But once again, a replacement alloy tailpipe here at the rear, which looks like it could be maybe a Fresco made part. But moving on to the back of Neil's Honda, we have another very nicely sculpted alloy rear swing arm, which of course is replacing the steel original part that would have been fitted here in 1980. But it certainly all looks great, coupled up with those brand new gold anodized SM Pro Platinum alloy wheels. But as I just previously mentioned, Neil's bike was just one of the many immaculately prepared Honda Red Rockets that littered the Helsington Paddock on the Sunday race day. Right, so next up, it's a nice 4-banger thumper, and this bike here is Rupert Hills' big 1977 Shenny 540 Yamaha. Now, Rupert's machine certainly does have an original Eric Sheney built chassis, and it uses one of those big TT500 Yamaha engines as its power plant, and his particular motor here has been bored out to 540cc. And Rupert's bike here certainly uses bits and pieces from many other makes and models of bikes, which he said doesn't bother him in the slightest, and with Rupert being about 6'7" tall, you'll certainly get no argument from me on that particular matter. But as you know, these big TT or XT 500 motors are more or less unbreakable, and they can certainly take a lot of punishment from even the toughest and quickest of riders, and they just keep powering on, which is why riders who like their thumper 4-strokers always seem to put these big Yamaha motors at the top of their list when they're choosing an engine to power their brand new bike. Although there's certainly no bling or shiny bits and pieces on Rupert's big Yamaha, as this is a fun focused racer and not a concourse winning contender, and you can see that there's certainly mega clearance there at the back of the bike with those quite long shocks, and Rupert of course will be racing this 4-stroker in the pre-1978 class on the day, so again you may catch a glimpse of him on this bike in the racing highlights to follow. But certainly a nice alloy fuel tank, which I'm pretty sure is an original Eric Sheney design from back in the late 1970s, and you can also see here that it's been custom made to fit the frame and to allow the camshaft cover of that big Yamaha 4-stroke motor to squeeze in underneath. But you can certainly see that she's got quite a tall back end on this Shenny Yamaha, and Rupert will have no problems at all slinging his leg over this old timer due to his very tall stature. But once again, another very nice old school kind of dirt bike with one of those historic Eric Sheney built frames, coupled of course with that ultra reliable Yamaha 4-stroke power plant. But on the subject of old timers, this antique British classic is Vince Hale's 1967 BSA 350, another vintage classic that's managed to borrow parts from other types of machines to put it all together. Now, I don't have any details of any of the parts on Vince's BSA, but I'm guessing that the skeleton of the bike is maybe a BSA Victor frame, and this motor here is, as I said, a 350 BSA power plant, and quite a popular motor for riders who use these B40 engines in these old school scramblers and trials bikes of the pre-1960 and 65 classes. Although if you're looking for an original BSA Victor from 1975, it's probably best not to include Vince's bike in that search, because his bike's about as unoriginal as it can get, although the motor here is without doubt the real deal when it comes to BSA engines from that time period. But the rear end of Vince's race bike has a pair of relatively modern Falcon rear shocks, which, as I remember, were pretty good units, because I did use these kind of shocks myself back in the day. But at the front end of Vince's hybrid BSA is a pair of forks that I certainly don't instantly recognise, but they could certainly be a pair of Serianis or maybe something similar. But on the other hand, there's certainly no mistaking this front hub and brake that's been borrowed from the mighty German Mico. And Vince has also went the full hog here and used a Mico hub and brake and wheel on the back as well. So there's certainly a bit of that European flavour creeping in to this particular British built Bulldog. And this is a prime example of backstreet engineering and using whatever parts you have just languishing around in your workshop in order to build some form of off-road motorcycle that you can use at the weekend. And to be fair, it certainly looks like Vince's achieved that particular goal. Okay, so just to conclude this part one walkabout around the 2023 Helsington Paddock, we're going to finish off by taking a look at Mike Dowson's 1980 Honda 125, which once again was another one of the many smaller capacity machines that took part in this Helsington race event on the day. And yet again, another lovely example of one of these iconic bikes from that 1980s era, powered of course by this compact and quite awesome 6-speed two-stroke motor, which of course, as long as you kept it singing in that mid-range, it would still propel you down the track at quite a decent rate of knots. But most of this 1980 125 was a complete redesign on the 79 bike that Honda made in the previous year, which of course the less said about that particular model the better. But this brand new 1980 machine was an absolute belter and a big favourite with 125 racers in that year. But the front forks on this bike are pretty much the stock items on a little Honda 125, because this is about as original an example as I've seen on one of these 1980 bikes, which of course now have the much more sensible 21-inch front wheel and not the weird and obscure 23-inch front wheel that Honda fitted to their 1979 model that of course had their claw action front tyre that owners thought was made of concrete because it was so damn hard. But certainly this is still a little belter of a bike, this Mike Dowson machine, which I'm pretty sure has undergone some kind of refurbishment or restoration recently, because it's in far too good a condition to be a 43-year-old dirt bike. But having said that, it's all been done properly with all the proper parts that you'd associate with this 1980 125. But things like these Maxxis tyres aren't of course stock 1980 items, but then again you have to expect that on a bike of this kind of vintage. But once more, the original Showa piggyback shocks from 1980 with their alloy shock bodies, and of course those finned piggybacks to try and help dissipate that heat. But once more, Mike Dowson's CR Honda was just another one of the multitude of vintage 125s that attended this year's Helsington Scramble. And of course, we will be taking a quick look at a few more of these kind of 125 racers when we return with our part 2 video from around the Helsington racing paddock. And so until next time, thanks for watching, and of course we will speak again very soon.